So please move forward if you would like to see. I mean, I tell my students, you know, they're responsible in the exam for what's on here, so they better move forward. Okay, let me ask you. You know, Prayas has the first two subjects, health and energy. How many people here consider themselves mainly health people? Okay, and how many consider yourself mainly energy people? Okay, well, you know, it's sort of a split evenly. I would say that this subject here is the most important interaction between the two globally. It's the most important energy side of health, and it's the most important health side of energy globally. Not that there aren't other big problems in health and energy, coal power and nuclear power and whatever, and certainly many other problems in health. But in terms of the interaction, I don't know, I mean, the evidence is pretty clear that it's the biggest single interaction. Now, I'm you know, going to talk about both sides of this, the energy and health side, and it's probably not going to be quite enough health for the health people, not quite enough energy for the energy people, but recognize the other people, you know, it may not, probably too much health for the energy people and so forth. So, I'll make that. And I used to consider myself an energy person. And I think I know something about it. But I'm realizing, I mean, I'll give you one of the bottom lines, is unfortunately, we've been thinking about this problem as an energy problem, when it's actually a health problem. And when you think of it as a health problem, it gets very different perspectives, and you come at it in very different ways, and I'll try to explain that as we go along. So I'm talking about people cooking with solid fuels. This is the distribution in the world. As you can see, in Africa, 70, 90% or 95% of people cook with solid fuels. India is about 60%. China's, you know, about 50%. And it's, you know, it's basically one-to-one with poverty, isn't it? In fact, if somebody sent you an email tonight saying, I'm coming from Mars tomorrow and I only have 2 hours on Earth and I want to see poor people, just tell them to go where they're burning solid fuels. I guarantee you there's no rich person burning solid fuels and there's no poor person using gas. So it is the very most, by definition almost, the very most vulnerable group in the world. Now that's, you know, gives us some hope that we want to help these people. On the other hand, it makes research difficult because all the diseases that are associated with this pollution exposure also have other risk factors, you know, poverty, related risk factors, malnutrition, bad education, poor access to health care, and so forth and so on. So the research has to distinguish what's being caused by the smoke as opposed to what's being caused by these other risk factors, and that's, you know, the science of epidemiology and health research. And so one study never is enough. You know, you have to have multiple studies by multiple investigators in multiple places using multiple designs before you start being convinced. Now, you know, basically, I'm not going to talk about coal much. It's not a big issue in China. Just to say it's worse than biomass. I mean, it's not a big issue in India. It's a big issue in China. Now, some people say, well, you know, wood smoke is natural. Yes, it's natural. There were forest fires before humanity. There were forest fires after humanity. And I like the smell of it. It reminds me of, you know, camping with my parents when I was a child or something like that. Well, you know, of course, in the health field, we know natural things are hardly necessarily safe. You know, malaria is natural. I mean, arsenic is natural. Snake venom is natural. I mean, botulism is natural. I mean, you've got a long list of things that are natural that will kill you right off. In fact, most of humanity has spent most of human history protecting itself against natural things. So natural is no guarantee of safety. Somebody who knows more will say, well, when the wood burn, doesn't it just change to carbon dioxide and water? After all, wood only has basically carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which is true. It doesn't have much, it doesn't have metals in it or not even much sulfur. It's, you know, pretty much pure. It contains just these chemicals or these elements. And CO2 and water are not, you know, toxic materials. Yes, that's true, but the problem is it doesn't burn completely. The combustion efficiency, as we call it, is far less than 100%. A lot of the carbon doesn't go out as CO2, it goes out as something else. Now, what does it go out as? Well, this is a typical wood-fired cook stove in India. This is Indian data that we took. Actually, Joshi was here, was involved in this. Kishore too. Here's a typical stove, fairly well operating traditional wood-fired cook stove. Call it a chula. 1 kilogram an hour of wood for a normal family. That's about this much energy. 18% goes into the pot. It's pretty good. Traditional cook stove. 74% of the energy just goes out into the environment. But 8% doesn't even get turned to energy. It stays as products of incomplete combustion. A whole range of things that could have been burned to CO2, but were not burned to CO2. And I'll show you what those are. Now, I call this a toxic waste factor. Now, you say, well, this 6 to 20% of the fuel carbons change to toxic substances. Now, and I know you're saying, so this guy's exaggerating toxic substances. I don't know what this is. Now, let me show you what these things are. This is the pollutants in biomass fuel smoke. Thousands of things identified. First of all, the standard air pollutants, small particles, carbon monoxide, NO2, things that we control, for example, in outdoor air pollution, but a vast number of other elements. Here organized in chemical categories, saturated hydrocarbons and so forth. But I put at the end examples in each category of known toxic materials. Maybe some of your favorite things, like benzene and benzopyrene and formaldehyde. These are well-known carcinogenic or otherwise toxic materials. Even dioxin. We published a paper, we measured dioxin levels in village houses. Now, many people think of formaldehyde, benzene, and so forth. These are industrial chemicals. Yes, they are. But probably, I can't say this for sure, but probably the highest total exposure in the world is actually in village houses. Now, what does this mixture remind you of? Now, I always tell my students in the health classes that anytime anybody asks you a difficult question that you can't answer, just say tobacco, and you're probably right. Yeah, what's tobacco? Burning biomass. Right? But is it a complete combustion? Why do we know it's not complete combustion? Well, first of all, yes, we see the smoke. But what's the main reason? Cigarettes are designed not to have complete combustion. Why is that? Because if they burned up the nicotine, people wouldn't smoke. So they're designed to heat up, to burn partly, heat up the tobacco, release the nicotine, and you get your dose, and it's a drug delivery system of a cigarette. Now, cigarettes are the most well-studied biomass smoke in the world by far. I mean, orders of magnitude more than anything else, many billions of dollars, tens of thousands of studies. Does anybody here doubt that cigarette smoking is bad for health? All right. Now, 15 years ago, some people would have raised their hands. Nobody has the courage to do so now. It's really bad for your health. Sticky, burning stuff in your mouth is about the dumbest thing you can do. You know what the risk is? How many smokers die of the habit? 10%, 5%. 50% of smokers die of the habit. Now, everybody dies. Now, sorry to report this, but they die younger than they would have. Far younger, average of 10 years. That's a really big risk. So nothing reaches that risk. But now, since this mixture of wood smoke is in many ways quite similar to cigarettes, but not the same, there's no nicotine in wood smoke. There's some differences, but basically it's very similar. It's the same set of diseases are caused by wood smoke as caused by cigarettes. And we know a lot more about this, and I'll show you more about it. Now, how does smoking a cigarette compare to wood smoke and say from a chula? Well, one way of looking at it is a typical chula releases about 400 cigarettes an hour. Now, that doesn't mean the woman is sticking 400 cigarettes in her mouth. It means she's got 100 people smoking 4 cigarettes an hour sitting in her kitchen. Now, that's a lot of smoke. So maybe when I show you the health effects, since you've accepted already the health effects of cigarettes and sticking in your mouth, it won't seem quite so surprising. They're not as big as cigarettes. Don't believe that. But they are big. So this was a study published a couple of years ago. very large study involving hundreds of people, looking at the burden of disease, how much mortality and morbidity or death and illness was caused by a whole range of risk factors, including malnutrition and obesity, air pollution and water pollution and lead and all sorts of things. And I was chair of the group that looked at household air pollution, and this is our more detailed paper. If you want, you can get it on my website on the details of how we calculated this for household air pollution. But this is a small part of a very large effort. So how do you do this? How do you figure out the health effects of these exposures? Well, you need to know the exposure, how much people are exposed to. How many people smoke cigarettes, and how many cigarettes, for example. Then you need to know the exposure-response relationships for those of you in health. That's the epidemiology, the relative risk. Smokers have 30 times more lung cancer than non-smokers, for example. Or heart disease, they might have 2.5 times more heart disease than non-smokers. You combine these two, I'm not going to go through the math, but a well-known procedure in health. And that tells you that, say, in the case of smokers, it's going to be something like 70% of lung cancer is caused by smoking. But how many deaths is that by? You look at the number of lung cancer deaths, multiply by 70%, you get the total amount. You get this for heart disease and stroke and all of the different effects. So you have to know how much people are exposed, what the epidemiology tells you, and the background disease burden in order to do these calculations. All right, this is the background disease burden in one way of stating it in India, 1990 and 2010. These are not by cause, but not by what caused these diseases, but what the disease was, what might be on a death certificate or a doctor's diagnosis. And lower respiratory infections is number 2, was number 2 in 1990. Diarrhea has come down a bit. Tuberculosis has come down a bit, at least in ranking. Malnutrition has gone way down in India. A success story. COPD is coming up as the smoking epidemic comes in. Heart disease is moving up. And this is the background disease rate, and these we can look at these up in the global burden disease study. All right, that's one thing is the background disease rate. What about the concentrations of air pollution? Well, of course, we haven't measured air pollution in every house in India. And we haven't, we've only measured air pollution in a few thousand households. But we've done, pretty well at distributing those across the country. And we've developed, in this paper, we developed a model based on the measurements we have made to estimate the air pollution levels by state. And if you're interested, you can look at the model. And this is the result. It shows you, as you might expect, air pollution levels are lower in the south. Housing is more ventilated. People sometimes, cook more outdoors more often and so forth. And as you move north, the levels get darker and the concentrations are higher. And this was based on, 2,000 measurements in households across the country, and then a model using the National Family Health Survey, household characteristics to do the model. All right, I'm going to have to rush through this. What about the epidemiology? Well, one way of getting at this is to look at all the studies on a particular thing. This is child pneumonia and household air pollution. And there were 20, you do a search of all the world literature, and you find thousands of things that might fit, and then you look at them all and you bring it down, and finally end up with 26 papers that were really independent and well done. And this is a statistical technique that combines the results of all of these papers into one final estimate. That final estimate in this case was 1.8, basically. Now, for those not in the health field, that means that somebody a child living in a house with a dirty fuel, like biomass, has about 80% more pneumonia than risk of pneumonia than a child living in a clean fuel. Now, is 80% big or not? Well, child pneumonia is the chief cause of death of children in the world. Yes, it's a very big number to say that 80% of increase, and then when you consider 60% of the children in the country are exposed, you start seeing how you get some very big impacts. Now, one of the developments in this new burden of disease that I think helps convince those people who still think that wood smoke is good for you, or at least benign, is what we call these integrated exposure-response relationships. This is the paper published this year. And basically what you do is you look at the evidence, not just only for household air pollution, for outdoor air pollution, smoking, secondhand smoking. All of these are combustion particles. That's the main, indicator of risk. And you combine them together, integrated exposure across the entire spectrum of exposure, and I'll show you the results. So here, for example, is the child pneumonia one. And, unfortunately, this is a log scale, and I'll show you a linear scale in a minute. But you can see the data points. These red ones are for our randomized trial in Guatemala, where we actually measured the exposure on children. It's, pretty good evidence. These are from secondhand tobacco smoke studies. These are from outdoor air pollution studies, all brought together in one. And here are the sources of the data, and this is the model that combines them all. So that was child pneumonia. Now, what about cardiovascular disease? Cardiovascular is chief outcome of outdoor pollution, chief outcome of smoking. What about household pollution? Well, we haven't done any studies on heart disease and household air pollution. Not that we've got negative studies, we haven't done any. I think they're underway now, but they haven't been done. So what do? Well, if you look at the integrated exposure response curve, here is the studies on heart disease, and here is the dose of particles. So these are studies of outdoor air, and this is the risk of heart disease, 1.5, 2, and so on. This is the total dose of particles you're breathing each day. Here are the outdoor air pollution studies. Here are the starred ones of the secondhand tobacco smoke studies. These are the active smoking studies. And the area, our exposures that we find in village houses in India and elsewhere are around this area. They call it the HAP zone. So the argument we've made that passed peer review and was published and so forth, but you may decide not to accept, but it was accepted, is that if our exposures are in between, the risk must be in between. It would be rather astonishing. The risk dropped to 0 here and then came back up again. Why do we draw graphs? We draw graphs to interpolate on them, and that's why we draw them. Now, extrapolating, that would be something different. You're always, in your 7th grade class, they told you not to extrapolate off the end of your data. But that's not that. We're in the middle of our data. So this is how we develop the risk for heart disease. But admittedly, there haven't been any studies of heart disease itself. And this is what that curve looks like on a linear scale. So it means that as you get up higher and higher, the risk goes up. These are the outdoor air pollution studies there. These are the secondhand tobacco studies. And the smokers, because they're sticking the burning stuff in the mouth, they're not even on this graph. They're over here because of the huge dose. Anybody guess how far over there they are? I mean, that's a deer. They're 30 meters over there. Don't stick burning stuff in your mouth. And, the household air pollution levels that we find in India and elsewhere for women are around in this area. Now, it's not that we have no evidence on heart disease risk factors and air pollution. We have our randomized trial. We found the stove and reduced blood pressure. This is a good study in China. They found also an effect on blood pressure, and they also found a dose-response relationship, like I showed you. Another study of ours in Guatemala showed that this is related to heart. ST segment is something cardiologists use to indicate the risk of heart disease. So these are quite consistent with a heart disease risk, but they aren't heart diseases. So this has been done for a whole bunch of diseases. This is ischemic heart disease, this is stroke, this is lung cancer, this is COPD. I know you can't read those, but just to show you that the modeling has been done and there's been a lot of data gone into it. This is the summary of it for stroke, ischemic heart disease, few lower respiratory infections, especially child pneumonia. And this is lung cancer. Interesting, the lung cancer one. Notice the shape of these curves. They taper off at the end. At very high doses, you reduce the dose a bit, you don't get that big a change in risk. This one, you get hardly any change in risk until you get down well below 100 micrograms per cubic meter, which is the metric we use. But lung cancer is almost linear. So if you reduce, lung cancer from 300 to 150, which a good biomass stove might do, you can cut lung cancer risk in half. But you won't do that for stroke or ischemic heart disease. This is all of them together, and you see all of them flatten out, except lung cancer, flatten out at high levels, and there are parts of the world that are living up here in terms of household air pollution. So it's not a linear thing, and this has profound implications for policy and for designing clean interventions. I'll get to that. So, I said all of this. I'm going to skip this. This is the results of the global burden of disease study. Here's for the entire world, the top 20 risk factors. High blood pressure, number 1. Tobacco smoke, number 2. Alcohol, here's household air pollution from solid fuels, is number 4. Now that's with 60% of the world not exposed at all. People using gas or electricity. If you want premature deaths, instead, deaths are not the greatest metric, in spite of the fact that they're commonly used, because, as I mentioned, and I'm sorry if this news, but everybody has to die. And it makes a big difference whether it's an 88-year-old or an 8-year-old. It doesn't count the age, the prematurity of the death. And we obviously care much more about an 8-year-old dying than an 88-year-old dying. We're sad to lose our grandmother, but it's tragic to lose our child. So that's why we use lost life years in the health field instead of fewer deaths. So, glad you like this. High blood pressure causes 9 million, alcohol causes 8, tobacco causes 6, secondhand tobacco smoke 0.6, household air pollution about 3.6 million deaths. And what's this? Secondhand cook smoke. That's the outdoor air pollution created by chulas. Where does the smoke go? It might go out of the house, but it doesn't disappear. It stays in the village. It goes downwind. It becomes part of general outdoor air pollution. I'm not going to talk about it here. We'll be publishing a paper next week. It's been accepted. It's coming out next week. 26% of outdoor air pollution in India comes from chulas. That's small particles. So you can't really solve the outdoor pollution problem until you deal with, now there are many causes of outdoor air pollution, power plants and vehicles and so forth. But chulas are part of it. And that's globally about 3 lakh premature deaths. All of these, we don't understand these numbers so accurately. All of these are very similar. This is obesity, physical inactivity, outdoor air pollution, salt intake. These are all about the same. There's these kind of big boys up here, and then there's the second tier that are really all very big also. Now this is India. A set of dietary risks that they group together are number 1, household air pollution, number 2. Now what are these colors? Well, this set is the chronic respiratory disease, COPD. This is the cardiovascular disease, and this is the child pneumonia. Very similar set of things as smoking, except babies don't smoke. So this is secondhand smoke only that's causing the effect in child pneumonia. What about, males, men in India? Well, smoking is number 2. Household air pollution is number 3, although substantially smaller than smoking. What about women? Well, household air pollution is number 1. There's women and girls. They don't know, men and boys. So, by the global burden disease effort, it's the single largest risk factor examined among the 67 examined for ill health in India, so women and girls. So, 10 lakh annual premature deaths, 1/4 of the global total. Secondhand tobacco smoke, about 1 lakh more in India. 10% of national mortality, about the same as tobacco, 50% more than outdoor air pollution. That's the estimates. So it's these are big uncertainty bounds around them. But given now that we understand the relationship with other combustion particle evidence, these numbers are not going away. Might get a little bigger, might get a little smaller next time, but they're not going away. They're big numbers. All right. All right. So what do we do about this? I'm talking about the old paradigms, and then I'm going to talk about the new paradigms. The old paradigm is, well, let's just let people get rich and get, and develop, and people will buy gas, and we'll forget about it. I mean, after all, nobody uses solid fuels in my country or in England anymore, and open fires for cooking. Maybe, that'll happen in India eventually. But how eventually is that? Well, let's look at, the energy ladder ideas. It's been used in energy, as energy people will know. Is this working? Hello? No. I guess. Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So this is the energy ladder, and shows that this is increasing development, income, if you like, and this is the axis here. I've got is decreasing air pollution, emissions from the stove. So poor people use ag residues, including dung. About 15% of households in India. 50% use wood, and a tiny bit use coal. Kerosene cooking is not very popular anymore. Biogas is coming up, but it's still small. LPG is the next big one, which you're using probably. And a little bit of pipe natural gas, and electricity used for cooking. That's the current energy ladder in India. Well, people hear me okay?
Yeah, you use the recording.
Yeah. Okay. So the idea here is that the increasing prosperity, people will move up the energy ladder and move up. Now, this line I put here between the non-solid and solid fuels is a very important line. It's not just convenience in terms of the material. These are the relative emissions of pollutants from cooking. And if you take LPG as one, you get below this line and it's 400 and more. I mean, 400 times more. So this is a big difference between here in current situation. Well, has this worked in India? In 1990, 85% of the population used solid fuels. That was 700 million people. In 2010, only 60% used solid fuels. It was still 700 million people. In 1980, there were only 700 million people. There's been no improvement. Sure, the fraction of people, you people, are not using it. But the poor people, there's still 700 million people stuck in this, I call it, the chula trap. And this is true globally. There are 2.8 billion people using solid fuels globally. There were 2.8 billion people using them in 1990. Now it's going down in China and up in Africa and about the same in South Asia. It's not going away by itself. Something we need to do something else. So paradigm 1 or paradigm A, is not working. What about paradigm B? Well, many hundreds of so-called improved biomass stove programs over the years, and the first ones I know of in India were back in the 1950s, so-called smokeless chulas. And so. I dare say hundreds of programs over the years. Okay, many programs. There was a national program in China and India in the 1980s, covering about 200 million households in all. The National Program for Improved Chulas, it's called in India. There's a new program in India today that's putting in a few million so-called improved stoves. Many NGOs, big and small. There's an international organization called the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. A lot of activity. Until recently, however, this was mainly focused on energy, saving fuel. And the Chinese program in particular is considered to be a great success story. They greatly improved the efficiency of biomass use in rural areas and so forth. But what about the health side? Now that we realize that the health impacts are so important, how much effect can these stoves have on health? And of course, there are hundreds of stove models. These are just a few examples. This is a classic Chinese model that they introduced. You know, a very popular thing with file and it has a chimney in the wall. And this is the one we did the randomized trial with in Guatemala. And here's a range of designs that you see in India and elsewhere, where there are dozens and hundreds of designs. This is one of the most sophisticated stoves that's coming on the market now in India. It's a biolite stove. And it has a neat thing. It generates its own electricity for the blower. One way to get better combustion is to have a blower. And it doesn't need to be plugged in. It generates its own electricity. Not only that, you can charge your cell phone from it. So this is a neat design. I'd say it's probably the most modern one out there. It hasn't quite hit the market yet, but will soon. So a lot of effort is going into this, and many of these save fuel. In fact, all the good ones save fuel. What about smoke? Well, the health effects research has expanded greatly, as you saw a little bit of. Now standards are being developed with the International Standards Organization, with the WHO involved, World Health Organization. As I mentioned, often improvement in fuel use has occurred, but unfortunately, the cleanest models that have come out have only been disseminated in a few black households, none of them. And almost, the vast number of those disseminated haven't been clean. They may have saved fuel, but they haven't been clean. No biomass stove in the world, as of yet today, and I'll show you the numbers, comes close to the boundary, that boundary between the solid fuels and the non-solid fuels. So the approach has been to try to take the available, I call it, and make it clean. Make the available clean. But that's a very difficult thing. Don't know whether we can cross that line. It's actually quite difficult technically to burn biomass cleanly in an inexpensive device. The biomass is not regular. I mean, it's wet one day and dry the next. It's big and it's little, it's mixed, it's dirty, and the woman is just trying to cook. She just puts it in there as she wants. She's not a technician in the lab. There are many reasons why it's difficult to burn biomass cleanly. You go to Switzerland, you can buy a 10,000 euro wood stove that's got a catalytic converter or electrostatic precipitator on it. That's clean. But it's going to be a long time before we have 10,000 euro wood stoves in India. I'm not saying it can't be done. And there's been much improvement, but we aren't there yet. Now, let me show you. Even major reductions in emissions still lead to very small health improvements, and I'll show you. Putting a very large technical challenge to solid fuels to reach 99% or greater emission reductions. Very difficult. Maybe not possible. A lot of improvement. So here are the best available emissions data from an independent laboratory. A lot of people do emissions data of their own stoves, but it's hard to know whether to trust them or not. But these are from the EPA labs in the U.S. This was the best stove, the Philips fan stove at the time that was on the commercially available. There you can see it's much better than the others. In this particular, this is particles per unit time. And now, just last week, November 12th, the WHO released their indoor air quality guidelines for household fuel consumption. These are health-based guidelines. They say how clean does a stove have to be and still meet the air quality guidelines that the WHO established. It's the same air quality guidelines outdoors and indoors. Why should it be different indoors than outdoors? Every place people spend time, it should be they should be protected. Some countries have established higher indoor standards than outdoor. What's the justification of that? I mean, it should be protected wherever you go. These are non-occupational. They still haven't dealt with the dirty industries. But for where the public goes, the idea is it should be same protected at the same level. So that's the assumption behind this committee, and you can look it up on the web. And they've got press releases and frequently asked questions and summaries and so forth. So how close to clean enough are we? Given the WHO thing that just came out this week. Well, the new WHO indoor air quality guidelines for particles are 0.23 milligrams per minute. Given that there's a range of houses, like in India, you have big houses, little houses, you have well ventilated, not so well ventilated, you have people who cook all day, people who good part of the day. I was on this committee, we developed a probabilistic model. You know, to get to 100% protection would require very, you've seen houses, that are barely just this big, a slum house like this in India. You can't protect people in there with anything hardly. On the other hand, I've seen kitchens this big. It's this whole room. I mean, you don't need much, because it's so diluted there. So we, did a probabilistic model and came up with it. So to protect 90% of the households in India, you would have to have this much, no more than this much. Well, the cleanest biomass stove, that Phillips stove, is 30 times higher than that, and that's in the lab. And in the field, it won't operate like it does in the lab. So, we're still a ways. Now you say, well, I mean, the WHO is very, has very stringent requirements for health and stuff. Maybe India, they can't afford that. So let's take the Indian standard, the Indian outdoor standard, which is, 35. The WHO standard is 12, or guideline is 10, but India's is 35. China's is 35 too. So, maybe that represents what a developing country should aspire to. There's still, and to protect 60% of the households, which is, I think, barely enough, to justify a program. Still 4 times higher in the lab, that Phillips stove, and it won't work that way in a house, unless the woman is a trained technician. She's got exactly the right tools every day. So that's why this is still a challenge. That's a challenge worth pursuing, but a challenge. Need to push harder to find ways, I think, in addition to working on this problem, what other ways can we do? What other? So now I'm coming, let me show this again. So this is the child pneumonia graph, and this is the typical levels, that might be in India. And if you, were to come down with a quite good stove, a fan or rocket stove sold in India, you might get here. That's certainly better than there. But given the shape of this dose response curve, it going from there to here still leaves 80% of the pneumonia untouched. Now, is 20% enough? I don't know. I mean, it's not exactly a scientific judgment, but to have a big program and all sorts of excitement, just for the 20%, I think that'd be right. You probably wouldn't do a vaccine at that level. I mean, it would be, and then there'd be a lot of problems. People wouldn't use it right. And so forth. So, there's a judgment here. But wouldn't it be good to try to get down here? So, paradigm 1, title of the talk, instead of making the available clean, let's make the clean available. So last year, I was speaking at a meeting in Delhi on the occupational and environmental problems of the oil industry. And I was telling these people, they get beaten on because they're causing climate change and because they're causing diesel pollution, because they have oil spills, and they're getting a lot of bad publicity. And I said, you've actually got the most health beneficial fuel in the world to sell to people. LPG. 4 million deaths. All of which, how did we calculate this? We calculated the difference between the pollution levels and LPG. It's not zero pollution, there's no such thing as zero pollution. LPG doesn't have zero pollution, but it's very clean. So I said, you guys should, take credit for this. But on the other hand, if you're going to take credit, you need to do more to make it available to more people. It's a big job. And I made this speech, and it was applause by the audience, and I, went home. And notice this guy here. D. McRae was Secretary of the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas at the time. And he told me later, he went home to his office after this opening session, called in his LPG people and says, how many new distributors are we having? And they said, next year. And he said, well, the plan says 700. Let's make it 2,100. They couldn't do 2,100, they did 1,400. So in that one 30-second thing, he probably added, reduced exposure more to LPG, to pollutant than, probably many of the stove programs. Now he's initiated, and is continuing in the new government, a plan to initiated, but continuing on the government plan to develop to greatly expand access to LPG. Their number is 500 million people. That's very ambitious, but it will be big numbers. It requires understanding, preparing the upstream import arrangements, agreements with the Qatar, for example, where they import the port facilities, storage facilities, domestic infrastructure, cylinder manufacture. Look really entirely looking at distribution and the size and location of distributors, actually taking the cylinders to rural areas and setting in, people rural areas always complain they have to travel 10 kilometers to get their cylinder and then there's not any left. I mean, it's access, separate from price, access is not there. Modes of distribution, maybe distributing at community level instead of the household level. Technology upgrades, smaller cylinders that are more easily handled, more easily paid. People don't have a lot of money at one time. Better stoves, better lamps. A whole relook. I mean, this technology is 50 years old. We've asked the biomass stove people to upgrade their technology. These people need to upgrade their technology. Tired to look at subsidies. In the health field, we don't call antenatal care, prenatal care for pregnant poor women subsidy. It's a social investment. Call supporting primary schools a subsidy. It's a social investment. Vaccines for the poor. This is a social investment. So the LPG subsidy could be a social investment. Problem is, half of the subsidy goes to you, me. I get a subsidized LPG living in Delhi. You get it. Everybody gets it. What a waste. But the government is now initiating a program today in 53 districts. We can talk about it afterwards if anybody wants. I can tell you the details. A very different way of doing the subsidies that should release, many more wealthy people or even middle-class people who don't need the subsidy will not have it anymore, and that money that was spent on them can be moved down the income ladder to the people who do need it. So you can actually start moving the LPG bolus, if you like, the LPG down the income ladder, down the energy ladder, to poor people without increasing the total amount. But you have to have a way of targeting it better. And we can't call it social investment now because it's wasted on you and me. But if we can target it better to the poor, we can start calling it social investment. And then just changing the term makes a difference in how it's discussed. LPG technology is ancient, but there are some guys at IIT Guwahati who developed this very efficient new burner. They say it's 25% more efficient. So what does that do? It doesn't change the air pollution, but of course, that means that each meal is 25% cheaper. So that many more people can afford LPG. I saw this stuff, and now I can't get any information out of them because they're getting patents and things like that. But you need to encourage this kind of thing. So, another approach, in addition to making the available clean, is to make, I'm going to get rid of kerosene and coal, they're nasty. Most people want to get rid of them, so just make this simpler. We need to learn, see how much we can move this down. I don't know how much, but we should have a policy of trying to understand that, a research agenda, both in the field and at the policy level, to try to do that. Now, not cheap, but the benefits, the health benefits are great. In fact, if you do the standard health kind of economics on the benefits, the health benefits are greater than the LPG cost. The problem is the health benefits accrue to the people locally or sort of generally, and the health subsidy costs or the social investment costs accrue to the taxpayer, and so it's it's hard to balance these. So we need to learn how to balance it and do so in a politically and economically sustainable manner. But there are ways we've learned in other health interventions for conditional cash transfer, for example, or to link the energy sector to the health and rural employment sector, offer health insurance to people who use LPG and so forth. So these are kinds of things as part of the development agenda. All right, paradigm 2. I call it stepping out of the box. Now, as my friends know, I always show this picture in every lecture I give because this is the first person in human history to have an exposure measure doing the oldest task in human history. This was in Gujarat in 1981. And here you can see the air pollution monitor that she's wearing. We did this study at that time. It was the first time anybody ever measured pollution in this setting. And here's the filter, and it's taking the air from her breathing zone and captured it on the filter. Why do I call it the oldest task in human history? because the definition of becoming human was the learning to control fire. So by definition, it's the oldest task in history, mostly done by women. When my wife and I came on sabbatical last year, I was thinking, well, I'm still alive. Maybe she's still alive. 1981. So we went back to Gujarat. Well, here's what I looked like in 1981. The team for this study. And so we went back to Gujarat, went to the villages and walked around, photos and things, and sure enough, they said, oh yeah, that's the volley band down the road, and there we are last year. She was 70. She's still a little frail physically, but still sharp in the mind. She remembered being the first person in the village to wear the equipment, and I gave her a nice copy of that picture and said her picture had been seen by more people than Bollywood actresses, and I noticed neither of us have changed at all. A lot of interesting things to learn doing this, but I'm going to just talk about one of them. Well, there was a kind of commotion in the village. We were talking to her, video camera and stuff, and a woman down the street said, well, come and see my kitchen. So we went to her kitchen. She was the Sarpanch's wife, and more money, and she had, incidentally, in Walaben's house, she doesn't cook anymore. Her daughter-in-law is still using a chula. And I had her get to the rest of the story. And I asked, well, how did they improve stove burgers? And people, said, well, maybe 3, maybe 5 improved stove burgers. And I said, well, let me see one of the improved stoves. And they couldn't even think of a house that had one, let alone one that was being worked. So 30 years, stove programs have come along. So anyway, she has an LPG stove, this woman down the street, and she said, no, but I'm giving up my LPG. What is she giving it up for? You can see it in this picture. Induction stove. How many people know about it? How many people don't know about induction stoves? So everybody knows. But a lot of audiences, people, the first time they ever heard about it would be when I mentioned it. Now, Gujarat has 24/7 electricity. One of the only states that does in rural areas. And this has been only 24/7 for about 2 years. And yet she thought of it as more reliable than gas. Because gas, you run out Saturday night, nothing that you can't get a new cylinder. Sometimes you have to go somewhere to get it. It's hard to get, So she says it's cheaper, faster, safer, cleaner, and more reliable. It is cheaper than LPG, even cheaper than subsidized stuff. Now that's, I looked at stoves more than anybody else, I know of, and been into a lot of villages, a lot of kitchens. And, I hadn't paid attention to this revolution, but now, I realize this is a revolution. Now, how far this revolution is going to take us, I don't know. What is induction? It's entirely different technology than a regular electric stove. It's a high-frequency magnetic field induces the heat in the thin layer of the pot. So it's very efficient because it's focusing the heat right where it's needed. The hot stove itself does not get very hot. It's not hot enough to burn you. So it's safer. If your sorry falls on the stove, it doesn't catch fire. It's about 90% efficient instead of 60% of regular electric stove or a gas stove. That's a cooking process. Faster, probably 50% faster. Much more controllable. Safer and cooler. Long-lived, easy to clean. And large economies of scale because it's an electronic device, just like cell phones or televisions or whatever. You can, if you make them in large numbers, the price goes way down. Here's the schematic of it. You can see the magnetic field is created and it induces the heat right in the pot itself. There are these pictures on the web. You can see water is boiling on this side and there's ice cubes on this side because there's no metal to induce the heat, and you have to have an iron-containing metal, so it has to be an iron or steel pot. Here's the egg cooking on this side and doing nothing on that side. You can, heat it through the paper. The paper doesn't catch fire. You can still cook on top of it. It's a very different thing. It's not your grandmother's stove. It's a very different thing. And then I went to Kerala. Has electric peak early in the evening. Starting in the mid-last decades, they started experiencing fast-growing morning peak as well. Figure out what this Turns out massive sales of induction cook stoves are shifting the demand. Now their responses, because the electricity board researching this, was to try to suppress it. They put out posters, please don't use your induction stoves and so forth, because it was unbalancing their system. I told them, no, this is a good thing. This is really clean. And of course, those people are mainly LPG people who use induction stoves. It saves the government money actually, because they don't have to pay that LPG subsidy. And their experiences, this is I think anecdotal, that people like it. Then I went to Odisha, and because Nalco, the big aluminum companies, has introduced 10,000 to their employees. We now see Chaiwalas using induction stove. It's cheaper, faster than this particular guy on a road uses it when he can. When the power goes out, he shifts the LPG as a backup, but this is cheaper, faster. Here's an SDA market near my IIT where I work in Delhi, and there's a induction stove making roti. So there are now about 25 manufacturers selling induction stoves. These are some of them: European, Korean, Japanese. TTK Prestige is the largest Indian manufacturer of appliances, has about a third of this market. This marketing firm estimates the growth rate at 35% a year. Now, 35% a year is a transformational program, cell phone. Now, I don't know where this is going, and of course, it's mainly going into urban areas now. So the question is, where can it go into rural areas? Although when it goes into urban areas, what does it displace? It displaces LPG. That makes LPG available for rural areas. So even if only it goes into urban areas, it actually is part of this displacement factor. If you can develop the policies to capture that subsidy. This is what it looks inside, but what I made the point is it has one moving part. It's a little fan, like your laptop. This Chinese website is offering them for $8 each, 500 rupees. I have to buy 500, but they'll sell you 60,000 a month. Now, I don't know how good it is, but I'm just saying that the mass manufacturer makes a difference. So the next part of this is, how far is electric induction going to take us here? And how far could it go? And I'm not going to show it here. Natural gas is starting to come in Delhi and many other cities. There are actually 204 cities that have plans for natural gas. And as that displaces LPG, you can move LPG down because these displace LPG in this direction. All right. An example of many other leapfrog technologies: cell phones, satellite dishes, smartphones, EV grids. You don't have your grandmother's telephone. You don't have you don't have broadcast TV. Nobody's going to broadcast TV in villages. You have satellite TV. This is another leapfrog technology. Leaps over the old system. In China, it's already electrified in villages. Induction stoves are jumping off the shelves, as you see. There's just another leapfrog example from the past. That's the history of rice cookers. I won't go through. This is the history of rice cookers. But they do that. Rice cookers are just sort of tick off. They're now almost 250 million a year produced in China. Many of them sold here and in other places. Rice cookers are a very efficient device. Put the water in, put the rice in, click the button, and it's ready for dinner. It's more efficient than, why don't you use a flame to heat water? Induction does it much more efficient. Or a rice cooker, it's an insulated device. Rice cookers, you do see them in India, but not as much as you see in other parts of Asia. Of course, India has really taken up pressure cookers. And a pressure cooker saves energy and smoke. And every time you flick a switch, instead of lighting a match, it's better for health in a village house. So, TTK Prestige has developed now a rural version of its induction stove, and we're planning to try to do some tests in rural areas. 500, again, about 500 rupee production cost. And Ensign in Bangalore, the company is offering a $100,000 prize for a photovoltaic powered induction cook stove. Now that would be a revolutionary device. You don't have to be on the grid. Country of Ecuador is changing all the stoves in the country to induction stoves. It's the most rural country in South America. So how will these work? What else can be done? I don't know. But it's clean. Just like improved biomass stoves, you still have the problem of adoption. Will people use it? Will they give up their old stove? All of that. But you also have the problem of will they be clean? This will be clean. We know that. Gas will be clean. You can't make gas and electricity dirty at the house. You still have the problems of financing, usage, adoption, and so forth. But one problem you don't have. One last thing, is just a short one. The kitchen is not enough, it takes a village. Now, this is back in that first study back in Gujarat in 1981, we did these measurements. And just during the cooking time, I walked from the center of the village, I didn't go into any houses. And these are very high pollution levels. It's just between houses. And then I got to the edge of the village, went out into the fields, and the pollution went way up. Well, what was going on? Well, the smoke that's in the house may start in the house, but it doesn't stay there. It goes into the village. It becomes neighborhood pollution. That's why I don't use the word, I haven't mentioned the word indoor pollution this time, because indoor implies that a chimney is going to fix it. But a chimney, all the chimney does is move it 1.5 meters, and it's around the village environment. We don't deal with pollution just by moving it 1.5 meters. You have to cut off that pollution. And this illustrates why. And so changing out one stove at a time is not effective. That's changing out a whole village. It's just like sanitation. One person that gets a latrine has had no effect on the health of the village because everybody else is still defecating in the fields. You change out one, you stop cooking at all. All your neighbors are cooking, you're still going to get exposure. One of the things we're trying to learn how to do is do community level interventions for clean stoves. We've got a project in Haryana to develop a smokeless village. Just like they have these defecation-free villages scheme. So paradigm shifts, make the clean available as well as make the available clean, embrace, enhance transformational leapfrog technology. We've done it with everything else. Why should we, cooking be behind? Look for community solutions. A couple of things I haven't mentioned. Well, I did mention displacement, but just even in the cities, if you can displace the LPG, you can move it to where it is needed. And consider the health problem. In the health field, what do? We develop the very best vaccines, antiretroviral drugs, antibiotics, all of this globally, huge companies if necessary. And then we make it available. We beat down the price. We get these companies to agree to mass purchase or drop their royalties or whatever to lower the price. We move, and then we use NGOs and community groups to move these things into the rural areas where they're needed. We haven't done much of that in the case of the stove. But that is the health approach. Make the effective available. And we have, a whole set of phases of our trials, randomized trials, and effectiveness trials, and efficacy trials, and a whole standard set of procedures for providing the evidence that would be needed to do a mass intervention. So that's the end of my talk. Glad to take some questions. This is an old movable print. Artists don't pay much attention to cooking. Every other aspect of life they seem to cover, but I did find this one. It's got a chula. This is 400 years old or something. I mean, it's a copy of it. And let's hope in 400 years, this is not common as it is happening in 170 million homes tonight. Thank you.